So this weekend we're going to remember Rabbi Schulweis and commemorate the wonderful gifts of his life. One of the parts of his biography that's not very well known is that when he was a rabbinical student at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he found seminary sort of intellectually stifling, and, as many of us did. And what he did was escape downtown to NYU, New York University, and the principal philosophy teacher of New York University was a very famous New York Jewish intellectual by the name of Sidney Hook. Now, Sidney Hook was, in so many ways, the mirror image of Rabbi Schulweis's, or the obverse, the mirror image of Rabbi Schulweis's mentor, Mordechai Kaplan. Mordechai Kaplan, the great rationalist philosopher of Judaism, Sidney Hook, a great rationalist philosopher of, well, of politics and social thought. Kaplan thought that he could rescue the Jewish people. Hook thought that he could rescue American democracy. Hook wrote a very, very important book, which is germane for our conversation tonight. The book was called The Hero in History. And he asked a question, which is one of the classic questions that students of history ask. In fact, it's such a classic question that anyone who ever studies history has spent many hours in college dorm rooms over many bottles of cheap wine arguing this question, which is, do the times make the man, or does the man make the times? Translation: is a hero shaped by the events of the moment, and the hero rises up out of those events and responds to those events, so that it isn't really the personality or the values or the courage of the hero, it's really the events we ought to be looking at? Or do people shape the conditions of history so that we can look at a hero and say, that person was decisive in determining the shape of that moment in history and subsequent moments of history? Now, most historians come down in a sort of what they call dialectic, which is a great Jewish arguing tactic, which means yes and yes, which is to say that the times do shape the hero, and the hero does shape the times, and it goes back and forth. Hook came out slightly different in his book, as he always did. He always found a slight difference with the conventional thinking. Hook said it's true that the times set the condition, that the times ask a question, but it takes a very special human being to answer the question, to answer the call, to respond to those conditions, and to shape subsequent history. Hook believed in heroes. He believed that heroes have the power to shape the times and to shape subsequent events. But tonight what we're going to do is shift our focus. We've been talking about the rabbinic era, the rabbinic period in Jewish history. And we looked at that generically last week with Professor Hayes. We looked at some of the questions that the rabbis asked about the human being, the value of the human being. Tonight we're going to look at a hero. And the question that we're going to ask Professor Geraboff to help us understand is, did the times make the man, or did the man make the times? The hero is a name that you all know. His name is Rabbi Akiba. You all know him because there's institutions named for him and various other things named for him. But this was a personality. This was a person. At least he's a literary character as he appears in the text. And how he shaped the rabbinic mind, and how he shaped the subsequent history of the rabbinic period, and how he shaped the Judaism that we celebrate is tonight's topic. Our guide for this is a dear old friend, and I'm so glad you're here, Professor Joel Geraboff. Professor Geraboff holds appointments at the Arizona State University, which is playing in which bowl game? Do you know which? Sun Bowl. There you go, see? The Sun Devils are playing in the Sun Bowl, right? As well, he's an instructor and lecturer in rabbinics at the AJR, the Academy for Jewish Religion here in LA. As well, he's been the scholar in residence at Camp Ramah for many, many summers when we worked together, and a very, very dear friend, a wonderfully deep and thoughtful scholar of Judaism. Please welcome an old friend, Dr. Joel Geraboff. You got to speak right into this mic, or they'll yell at you.
I got it. I'll speak right into the mic. Good evening. Chag Sameach to everybody. So let me start. Eddie, we didn't quite go over this routine together, but I wanted to share a incident that occurs every year at my Passover Seder. wherever we are. So you all know at the beginning of the Passover Seder, after we figured out why is this night different from any other night, we get this interesting story. We get the story about 5 sages who sat up all night and discussed until their students came in and said, Rabbis, it's time now to cite the Kriyat Shema, the Shema prayer for the morning. So what happens at our Seder? Everybody says, aha! We're going to talk about, well, who are these rabbis? There's Rabbi Eliezer, and there's Rabbi Joshua, and there's Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and then there's Rabbi Akiba, and then there's good old Rabbi Tarfon. So I happen to have the pleasure of writing my doctoral dissertation on Rabbi Tarfon, and every year at the Seder, somebody has to say, aha, here comes Rabbi Tarfon, who nobody ever heard about, who I wrote 500 pages on for my doctoral dissertation, and which sold maybe 2 copies. So still nobody ever hears about who the heck is Rabbi Tarfon. In actuality, when I wrote this dissertation under my own teacher, Jacob Neusner, he thought that, well, this would be kind of like an exercise for me. It would take me maybe a few months, and then I'll do my real dissertation. It turned out there were about 200 sources in rabbinic literature on Rabbi Tarfon. Of course, one of the things academics suffer from, the worst thing you could perform on an academic is what I call a colonectomy. What's a colonectomy? Every title, of course, has to have a subtitle after the colon. And the worst thing is if you could write a title without a colon in it. So, of course, the title of the dissertation was Rabbi Tarfon, the man, the legend, in early rabbinic Judaism. So I want to put a little twist on Rabbi Feinstein's question. Does the man make the time? Does the time make the man? Or do the times, that is, the generations, make the legend of the man? Because in actuality, what we have in rabbinic literature, we have documents that were composed over 400 or 500 years. And we all know about, right, we could talk about whether, Lahavdil, this time of year we could talk about the legend of St. Nick, or we could talk about the legends of George Washington. What really a culture has is less than what the real person was, which historians are often interested in to try to figure out who was the real Rabbi Akiva. But what really has shaped Jewish life and Jewish culture are the stories about the people. What we call, academics call, collective memory. And I once was actually at a conference on heroes in Judaism. It was in Omaha in the Klutznick chair. And I actually studied a lot about the history of Jewish heroes. And you might be, Rabbi Feinstein might know that one of his predecessors, Rabbi Walter Ackerman, Dr. Walter Ackerman, who was a long time the head of Camp Ramah in California, actually wrote a whole piece on the importance of heroes in the Jewish education. So I want to make this a little bit more complicated because we're going to look at not so much the real Rabbi Akiva, but the Rabbi Akiva as he's understood and developed over the course of 300 and 400 years as evidenced in a whole range of rabbinic sources. So Rabbi Tarfon, of course, is not very well known. Probably most of us don't know that much about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, maybe Rabbi Eliezer and Joshua, but of that quintet, right? If I had said, so who are the 5 rabbis who stayed up all night and studied, I suspect, so, and I said, well, one of them is Akiva, most of you would say, aha, Rabbi Akiva, I heard of that guy. Tarfon, who the heck was he? So, in fact, Akiva has been a figure about whom a lot has been written. perhaps the most famous biography was written by Rabbi Finkelstein, Louis Finkelstein from JTS in the 50s. And actually in the last 2 years, another 2 biographies or studies of him came forward. One by, I didn't bring the book, I photocopied by Reuven Hammer, another important figure in the conservative movement who lives in Israel. And then a truly wonderful book by, I suppose, I don't know if you ever, that's a study with Barry Holtz, but Barry Holtz, who teaches at JTS, also just wrote a very fine study of Rabbi Akiva. And so I want to work with some ideas that both he shares, and fortunately, he very nicely cites many of these sources, so I didn't have to go find them elsewhere. And so I prepared a source sheet for us to really study at least some of these texts and to take some time. We'll read some of the texts, and then I'll stop, and we'll have a conversation. We'll move on to the next stories about him and texts about him. We may not get through all of these, but I hope this will give you some of the flavor of who this Rabbi Akiva is, bearing in mind the real question then becomes, how did he come to be constructed and remembered in a certain way? And to that degree, I would actually make the claim that cultures remember people in a certain way and create stories about certain people. And in that regard, they serve the interests of the people who remember. They serve the interests of those who remember people in certain ways and tell certain stories about them. To be sure, if we were able to go back to the actual times, stories get forgotten too. But once they get into written sources, of course, they get preserved. So trying to understand which of these may have been important and when, that's a very complicated issue. So let's look at text number 1. I don't know, I guess with the sound, I can't ask people to read because unless they have a mic, unless we have a mic, I can. Okay, so I'll read. So here's a good question. This is an interesting rabbinic source called the Avot de Rebbe Natan. It's a commentary on Pirkei Avot, right, the ethics of the fathers. This is a document that was composed at a certain time, and the question becomes, so what were the beginnings of Rabbi Akiva? How did he start? It was said he was 40 years old, and he had not studied anything. He's the perfect student for adult education. One time, he stood at the mouth of a well and said, "What hollowed out this stone?" He's at a well, and somehow he sees there's a stone, and somehow the stone has been made into a groove, and he asks, "What hollowed out?" He was told, "It is the water which falls upon it every day continually." And they said to him, "Akiva, have you not read the verse, 'Water wears away stone,' a verse from the book of Job?" The truth is, even if he had been in yeshiva, it's unlikely he ever would have read the book of Job, because it's not one of the more popular books. Unless you're feeling good and want to be depressed, then you can read the book of Job. Immediately, Rabbi Akiva drew the inference, that the verse applied to himself. He said, "If what is soft, namely water, wears down that which is hard, a rock, how much more so shall the words of Torah, which are hard as iron, hollows out my heart, which is flesh and blood." And he seems to have had a great revelation. All of a sudden, he seems to realize that even something hard, something soft can wear down something hard if it works at it continually, right? And it doesn't have to be immediate. It can take time. So he went together with his son. He's 40 years old. he goes together with his son and appears before a teacher of young children. Think about the dynamic. Would you be willing to sit with your child before somebody and say, I don't know anything, and I'm here with my kid, and we're going to kind of try to learn? He took one end of the tablet. Rabbi Akiba said to him, to the teacher, Master, teach me Torah. Rabbi Akiva took one end of the tablet, and his son took the other end of the tablet. The teacher wrote down Aleph, Bet. Obviously, unless you know the alphabet, you can't begin to learn. And he learned it from Aleph to Tav, from the beginning to the end of the Hebrew alphabet. And he learned it. He learned the book of Leviticus. They gave it to him, the book of Vayikra, and he learned it. He went on studying until he learned the entire Torah. What's the story trying to say about Rabbi Akiva? Thoughts? How is it depicting him, imagining him? Brave. Good. Good, he's brave. What? He's a late bloomer. How did he? Yeah. He's humble. He's curious. He's curious, but what stimulated his curiosity? Well, he admitted he knew nothing, but what got him on the road? I mean, what's this thing about the rock and the water? He sees something in nature. It stimulates him to engage in some kind of self-reflection. Yeah? So you had to stop, be observant. Yes? So somehow he knew that much about Torah, even though he had seemingly never studied Torah. Maybe he heard it on the radio. It was an advertisement for some place. Come study Torah because it's as good as iron and where you die. Well, that's not a great selling point, but I guess somehow that was attractive to him. Yes? Ooh, that's a good one. He wanted to have something to talk about with his kids. But it's interesting, because the issue is, hadn't he observed this thing, would he even thought to take his kid to study Torah? I mean, so there's some interesting dimensions to this story. So what does it say at the end about how he learned? So he has to first learn anything. Theoretically, it presumes that there's written sources, which is an interesting idea, even though Torah is supposed to be oral, right? But he's supposed to learn, he needs to know how to read. What happens once he masters reading? Okay, so you give him the book of Vayikra, but here's the interesting question. Does he have a teacher? Not mentioned. So one of the interesting issues here, is he a Wunderkind? Well, he's a Wunderalterkind, right? Is he some kind of a stupendous older person? Yeah. That's right, right. So, right, that is, if he unlocked the basic skill of knowing how to read, he obviously, people know language, right? There are lots of people who have oral knowledge of language, but the move from orality to written, which is really interesting here in the rabbinic interplay between oral and written, but it seems like he somehow having learned how to read, he now can learn the whole Torah, it says. And it doesn't seem like he has a teacher. I mean, the teacher is this teacher of little kids who gives them the basics. After that, he goes and runs with it. That's why I said it's like a Wunder Alte Kind, right? He's this wonder kid who manages to quickly master the entire Torah. So that's one story. And the origins of Rabbi Akiva seem to be from this observation of nature. His heart also gets softened. I mean, softened to the extent that he's willing to humble himself. You have this picture, he must be sitting, as it were, in kindergarten with his kid, and having sort of lowered himself to that level, his heart is already softened, and Torah seems to even soften it more. However, this is sort of what Rabbi Feinstein was just talking about, dialectic. Ah, what a wonderful guy. But then we get this text number 2. So he, that is Rabbi Akiva, went and sat before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua. My masters, he said to them, this is text 2, uncover the meaning of the Mishnah for me. This is an interesting story. All of a sudden now he has a teacher. Slightly different story. When they told him one law, he went and sat by himself. The Aleph, he thought, why is it written? This bet, why is it written? This thing, why is it said? He came back and asked them and reduced them to silence. And if you look at the top of the next column, I'm skipping a little bit, this is what Rabbi Akiva did to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua. Rabbi Tarfon said, aha, see, I got him in here. Akiva, about you Scripture says, he dams up the source of the stream so that hidden things may be brought to light, things concealed from human beings. Rabbi Akiva brought to light. And clearly, the text underscores that he quickly surpasses his teachers. Now, whether that's menschlichkeit or not, whether that's nice or not, I mean, so you here have, now he sort of has a teacher here, but he sort of quickly gets beyond them. And once he kind of learns this alphabet, he seems to be able to, he's not just any old little student. And at a certain point, the question is, does he need a teacher? Is that a good role model? Is this a hero? Are heroes people who have qualities that so exceed those of other people? Do those qualities make them people to whom we should aspire to be like? We should aspire to be like? Or do they become out of reach? And if they're out of reach, are they really helpful role models? Is a hero a role model? What do you think?
I used to tell this to my daughters when we were watching basketball, that they could not learn anything from watching Kobe Bryant because the athleticism was off the charts. But they could learn something from watching Tim Duncan, who was still playing at a comparable level because he was playing the sort of skills that you could teach a child. And so Tim Duncan became a role model. Kobe Bryant was just something to appreciate
Sorry. Yeah. Some of you who you probably have been to universities, right, have had people like that and go, what the heck did he just spend 50 minutes talking about? I didn't understand one word of what he said. Of course, people used to say, aha, a good event in the Jewish community was when you announced the program. Why? Well, we had so-and-so speak to us tonight. So what did you understand? Garnished. But he came and spoke to us. So anyways, that's a whole commentary on Jewish life. Now, who was... Oh, Avot Rabbi Natan Rabbi Natan theoretically is a rabbi learned at the early 3rd century. I should say Rabbi Akiva, as we'll see, lives in the first third of the 2nd century. Somewhere probably theoretically from 100 to 135. The texts themselves, this Rabbi Nathan is supposedly lived at the beginning of the 3rd century. This document, Avot Rabbi Natan, probably dates from the 5th and 6th century. Right? So this is this whole problem that these stories probably are not historically accurate. But this is what Avot Rabbi Natan is. It's what? Well, I mean, in general, let's just look at a few of them and you begin to sense these can't be all true. And they really are here. And the real issue is the rabbis really interested in telling historically accurate stories, or are they telling stories for what we call didactic or educational reasons? They're sermonic. It doesn't seem like the rabbis are terribly interested in history for the sake of history. They are interested in, like, as I said before, these become texts that are generated to speak to the interests of people who are compose them in the community or the audience for whom they're composed. So most scholarship would say this is not an historically accurate account itself. It's highly legendary, but it's trying to present a particular picture of Rabbi Akiva. We don't have time to explore the actual history of the development of rabbinic Judaism, but it was probably a lot fewer people than sitting in this room who actually stood behind the emergence of what we think of rabbinic Judaism. That's itself a fascinating fact of how few people can sometimes create a tremendous revolution over time. But it requires sensitivity to the age, because there are lots of brilliant people, but they say things that nobody's interested in hearing, right? So when you, one of the interesting things about studying history, when we study heroes, a hero is only a hero because there's a group of people who are interested in making him a hero or seeing him in a certain way. So from my perception, the writing of history by looking at great individuals, which was the way history used to be written. That's the way history was written until the 1960s, when people said we should write what's called social history. You should really understand the people who are the ones who buy into and move forward the particular individuals. So in this sense, I'm interested in trying to figure out who is telling the story. It's probably not historically accurate. And because if we look at the next text, this is a story some of you may well have heard. Here's another account. Rabbi Akiva was a shepherd. There's interesting parallels here to Moses as well. To Kalba Savua, who's a very rich guy. There's other stories about Kalba Savua. Ben Kalba Savua's daughter saw how modest and outstanding Rabbi Akiva was. Now, he's only a shepherd. I don't know how you're a modest shepherd, right? But he's a modest shepherd. And she said to him, very different story of how he became a student of Torah. If I agreed to marry you, would you go to study with a rabbi? The original love story. Or, very interesting, clearly the woman takes the initiative here and says, this is the farmer's daughter's story, except the farmer's daughter goes chasing after the hand who works on the farm, right? So this is the daughter of the owner of the sheep, and says to him, you know, I really like you, but I make you an offer. If you're willing to go study Torah, I'll marry you. Very different than story number 1 of how he became a student of Torah. So she was then there's a whole interesting dynamic. She was secretly betrothed to him, suggesting, who didn't approve? Father. This is another interesting story that a great hero, right, got betrothed by a woman who took the initiative, and her daddy didn't really like the idea. Pasnished for my daughter to marry, right? Pasnished for my daughter to marry a lowly shepherd. So she was secretly betrothed. Now, remember, in antiquity, betrothal is not marriage. It's more complicated. They have a long wedding period between the betrothal. But having been betrothed, she's exclusive to him, and he had, right, in that sense. So she becomes secretly betrothed to him, sent him away to study with the rabbi. When her father heard what she had done, he threw her out of the house and vowed that she would not benefit from his wealth. The old use the money leverage trick. He went, that is Akiba went, now look at this for a wonderful love relationship, and spent 12 years studying. And when he returned, all of a sudden, he has 12,000 students coming after him. There's a little hyperbole here, I suspect. He heard an old man saying to Akiva's wife, so he's coming along, he hears somebody say to his wife, how long will you continue to be a living widow? She replied to the old man, if he would listen to me, he would study another 12 years. Akiva hears this and said, so I'm going to do this with her consent. They didn't even meet. As the story is told, he overhears her saying, well, it's fine with me if he goes and studies for another 12 years. Very low demanding wife here, clearly. Right? And so he returned to his studies, stayed another 12 years. And when he came back home, guess what? He now has 24,000 students. This is Taka University already. It's one of the most successful Jewish educational institutions in the history of Jewish education. Halavai, we should have such productivity among our students. His wife heard heard and went out to see him now that he's come back. The woman in the neighborhood said to her, borrow some nice clothes and cover yourself. She quoted the verse from the book of Proverbs, a righteous man knows the life of his beast. Now, we won't get into this, is a very complicated story that she imagines herself to be a beast in front of her, an animal in front of her husband. When she came close to Akiva, she fell on her face, kissed his feet. His students started to push her away. The great rabbi has this woman clearly dressed, she's impoverished, right, dressed in rags, sitting at his feet. They want to send her away. He said to them, let her go. What's mine and yours are hers. Clearly, he recognized, even though it's been 24 years, right, that this is his wife. Her father heard that a great man had come to town, and he said to himself, I will go to this great man, and perhaps he can annul the vow that I made, that his daughter could not benefit from his wealth. So he went to him. Rabbi Akiva said to him, if you had known that your daughter's husband would be a great man, would you have made the vow? This is a ritual that if you make vows according to the Bible, they didn't have kol nidre yet, which annuls us from the vows. You had to do what's called hafka'at nedarim, which is somebody, if you make a vow without understanding the actual conditions you thought you were vowing to, then you can be released from your vow, and you don't have to fulfill it. So Bar Kava Savua said, if I had known that this would happen, right, I would not have made the vow. Akiva said to him, I am he. He thought this great sage has come. He didn't even realize it's his son-in-law, right? And so Bar Kava Savua fell on his face, kissed Akiva's feet, and gave him half his wealth. What is this story about? And compare it to the first story. What do you think the storyteller is trying to tell us about Rabbi Akiva here? It's actually a very complicated story. We could spend all night just on trying to analyze this story. Thoughts? She said, did he recognize the wife when she fell at his feet? And she just said, well, half is mine. But it seems, I think the storyteller wants to communicate he really somehow knew, because he knew the first time that she was the one who made the statement or overheard the statement. Remember the first time in the story that if I had known, he could stay another 12 years away, right? Now, it's clearly the story is about who are the real children? Who are the real children of Rabbi Akiva and his wife? The students. So this is a very rabbinic story, right, that the real students, the real children are the students of Torah that Rabbi Akiva manages to produce through all these years of study. It doesn't say he went to study with the rabbi, but it doesn't tell us any, right? Whatever she said, go and study with the rabbi, he goes, but quickly he's clearly become, right, he's become the chief honcho here. The Gloisa Talmud Chacham, right? He's the big Talmud Chacham here. And he has quickly thousands and thousands of students. And it's an interesting story. It speaks to what are the cultural values that make this story important for the audience. What would the audience have to buy into to find this a great story? In other words, the story is told for somebody. Yeah. Torah conquers all. Right. Well, wealth is really not what's important. There are other stories about how impoverished they were, and they had to go sleep in a barn, and she laid on straw. I didn't give you all those stories. And she eventually dreams to have what's called the Jerusalem of gold, which is actually some kind of a hairpiece they're known from antiquity, that looked like great cities. So you'd have on your head something that looked like the city or the outline of the city, and eventually in some stories she gets a Jerusalem of gold. But Torah is the key to wealth. We won't talk about it. We're not negotiating salary today, so it's okay. So this is this Rabbi Akiva. Would you find him a hero? Leaving his wife for 24 years? Producing students, but not. Yeah, well, I mean, there are all kinds of other issues here. If we want to talk about rabbinic attitudes, so sexuality, that's another dimension here. The story can be analyzed in terms of gender relationships. Yeah, I mean, clearly the children, there are references to a couple of children from Rabbi Akiva, but he's not seen as these are his real children. So, right. Now, how you bring, clearly the two stories can't, right? The stories are, right, clearly different people had different versions of how Rabbi Akiva got to be such a Talmud Chacham, because one story has a kid. In this story, he goes off and sort of all of a sudden has 24,000 students, but we don't know anything about children. Ah. So she's right. So the story actually, it's an interesting story in terms of what it wants to say about gender relationships. And clearly this is the old, the adage, behind every great man, there's some woman on the ground here, as it were. That though it's an interesting issue, to what degree did she really allow, she allows him to go study. She motivates him to go study. That's the whole underlying premise of the story. Why he went to study was, but she would marry him. Hadn't she made that offer, he would have been out there taking care of the sheep forever. He would have been a shepherd, right? So she's the one who makes the offer that he seems not to want to refuse. What's that? Well, that's the interesting issue. Is this the role for an Eshet Chayil? No. So, I mean, it's really interesting. It does sort of suggest that she appreciated Torah more than he. Originally. But if she didn't give him the yutz, not a shtach, but a nutz, right? I used to sit, talking of Seder, my Zayda used to always give me a shtach, a poke in the ribs. Why is everybody not paying attention? Anyways, that's a long story. But here you have a very interesting story, very different from the first. It's not because he observed something going on in nature. So clearly the rabbis wanted to depict them in different ways. Whoever stands behind these stories have very different understandings of what led Akiva and how he became a student of Torah. Yes? So the wife saw things in him that clearly he did not see in himself. And that's an interesting dynamic. So now you're going to go, who makes a hero ultimately? In this case, it's people in the society, in this case his wife, who perceive something in this person that the person themselves has not yet detected in themselves. Sure. Lots of disturbing parts to this story. Yes. Yeah, he gives it says at the end he gives half to him. Even though technically he could have given it to her directly, though she benefits from it indirectly, and that's an interesting issue. Why does it go to him and not to her at the end? Because after he would die, it would go to the children and not to her either. Right? I mean, that's a whole interesting dimension. And if he taken the money and helped build it, would he have donated it to help support his Torah students? Yeah.
Well, in that regard, the Bible mostly has money going to the male inheritors, except one place where
Yeah, the daughters of Slavchad. Right. But yes, so it's a good observation. Now, in a sense, is without getting into the technicalities, he could have given the money to her as a gift. But then it gets very complicated in Jewish law that the husband still would be the one who'd be able to invest the money. There's all kinds of complications in the Jewish law of property rights of men and women, husbands and wives. So maybe they wanted to avoid all those issues here, and they said he gave it to the son. Because he's a great man, right? So it's sort of because he was upset that she married some lowly shepherd. Of course, he's attracted to, does he come off looking good? Anybody like the father-in-law? No. I'll come back to you in a second. Yeah. Right. So he's not a total oxen. He's not a total stubborn person. He's not, it's interesting, all these dynamics of people who are willing to humble themselves or admit, in this case, oops, I did something wrong. Now, how do I get out of it? So there's a solution. So that's really interesting. So he comes off in the end, not so bad. Maybe there's some quality in him, too, that is meant to be the story is seeking to convey. These are characteristics we should emulate. That if you do something wrong, you should admit it, right, and move forward. Yes, one last comment, then I think we need to take our break, and then we'll continue after the break.
I just thought there was something strange in this particular story because he starts out as a shepherd, which reminds me of David.
Yes, good.
And he is at his feet, which reminds me of Ruth.
Yeah. As I said, these are so the observation was made. There are interesting what they call the fancy word is intertextual references, where one text clearly presupposes another text. When you grow up in a culture and you know certain stories, when you see certain references, it triggers other memories. So, besides, I mentioned Moses, but David also was a shepherd. David, in his case, was the youngest brother, right? The guy who wasn't supposed to succeed, right? In societies where you had what's called primogeniture, the first child, got twice as much. The notion was the first son, first son, right? You needed to make sure that they did well. The problem was if you had a plot of land and everybody gets an equal portion, by the time you're done, nobody can make a living off a speck of land, a little piece of land. So they created laws that favored elder sons. The biblical story, this is a whole interesting dimension. Who are always the heroes in the Bible? The younger. Right? We clearly upset the assumptions that the eldest is really going to be the hero. It's always the youngest. The person that you don't think is going to succeed, which is, by the way, I think personally that's how Jews view themselves. It's very powerful. We have a very powerful tradition for it, and it speaks to our minority culture. Relative to other people, we think 5 million Jews in the United States. Leaving aside, yes, there's Jewish poverty, but disproportionately Jews are successful, right? But we have a self-image that I think we acquire from our own cultural memories, from our stories, that somehow we succeed even though we should never have been successful. Sometimes conditions require it. It requires somebody to give you a push. Sometimes it requires you to be observant of what you see going on in the world and stepping back and being reflective. But it's very interesting that Rabbi Akiba whether true or not, right, they accentuate the fact that he was a late bloomer. He never got started until he's 40 years old, which is also a great value to say you're never too old to learn. It's a very, you think that's a Jewish value? So, I mean, it's interesting. Rabbi Feinstein mentioned I teach at the Academy of Jewish Religion. We have lots of people in their 30s and 40s, second careers, who've come back to become rabbis, cantors, whatever they are. And of course, with greater longevity to people's lives, people now, teaching in the university, people ask, what am I going to major in? Right? And so I teach an obscure subject called religious studies. What do you do with a degree in religious studies? Garnished. No, what do you do? What we tell people, yes, there are certain professions you might need to study that as an undergraduate. And so it's hard, but lots of things you learn to think. You gain self-confidence. You learn to hopefully communicate well. And you take those skills and you go where you need to go. Because the truth is, lots of professions that people are going to go into don't exist at the time they start their studies. They only come into being sometimes maybe by the time they graduate. All of a sudden, there's a field that didn't even exist 4 years ago. So the idea of, late blooming and keep pushing is an interesting value. Yes? We will get to Bar Kokhba. Yes, yes. The story doesn't end so well. Should we do one more and then we'll take our break? I just want to do one more and then we'll take our break. Text number 4. So this is another text. These are collections of sayings about Rabbi Akiva. So what was Rabbi Akiva like? A worker who took his basket and went outside. He found wheat. He put it in the basket. When he found barley, he put it in. Spelt, he put it in. Beans, he put it in. Sounds like a vegetarian here to me. This is a paleo diet. Lentils, he put them in. When he came home, he sorted the wheat by itself, the barley by itself. Sounds like he has a big basket. He throws everything into it. But when he gets home, he sorts each by itself, the beans by themselves, the lentils by themselves. This is what Rabbi Akiva did. He made the entire Torah into rings upon rings. It's obviously a metaphor. What's it trying to say? What's the key to Torah learning? Distinguish. To start. But he wasn't rich. He only had one basket to go picking with. And he threw everything in. But when he got home, he sorted it. So one of the things that's understood or claimed, so the first important document of Rabbinic Judaism is of Rabbinic Judaism, the oral Torah, somebody said it, Mishnah. Mishnah, unlike the Chumash where things are all jumbled together, and you could be reading a parsha in a Torah reading, and you'll have one law about agricultural matters, the next verse will be about sacrifices, and the next verse will be about how to treat the poor. The Mishnah is organized topically. So you have a tractate on Shabbat. You have a tractate on damages. You have a tractate on ketubot. And then each tractate has its own flow and logical organization. And by tradition, it's understood. So the Mishnah is produced by, in the end of the 2nd century, by a person some of you may have known, Judah the Patriarch, Judah the Prince. But scholarship suggests that, in fact, he drew upon the first effort at creating the Mishnah is credited to, guess who? Akiva. And this story, this little reference here. Keep that in mind. So Akiva is, in knowing Torah, he sorts it well. And theoretically, he is the producer of the first edition, as it were, of the Mishnah, which gets updated by Rabbi Judah, the patriarch. So he's a rabbinic scholar interested in law. When we come back, we'll see what else he's interested in. So thank you so much for your attentiveness, and I really appreciate all your comments, and we'll try to keep doing that. And I hope when somebody says something, I try to repeat it, so we are all able to continue the conversation. So we ended with this idea. Akiva is somehow the background of the first editor of the Mishnah. Keep that in mind. Jewish law. One of the things we've already seen, a very interesting dynamic, students and teachers don't always get along so well. And the rabbis, despite all interesting rabbinic stories about how you should show deference, kvod harav, to your teacher, well, we already saw it that in source number 2, that essentially Rabbi Akiva runs circles around his teacher, Rabbi Eliezer. Interesting, a different dimension of this is found in source 5. It once happened during a drought that Rabbi Eliezer stood before the congregation and recited 24 special prayers for the fast day. So in antiquity, when it didn't rain, they didn't blame it on global warming. They really had, the way they resorted to this was they declared fasts. And there were special prayers. You'd bring the Torah out to the city, middle of the village or the town, and you would start praying certain things. So the story's told this happened, and Rabbi Eliezer goes out and says 24 prayers, but guess what? Didn't happen. His prayers weren't answered. So Rabbi Akiva stood before the congregation after him and prayed not 24 prayers, but simply said, "Our Father, our King," in Hebrew would be Avinu Malkeinu, Ein lanu melech ela ata. We do not have any king but our Father and our King, and for your sake, have mercy on us. And guess what? It rained. What did you say? Yeah, this is not the Choni story. This is a different guy. Hey, this is easy. He doesn't. Well, the Choni's a different story, right? The circle maker. Right? No, that's fair. So then the rabbis murmured about Rabbi Eliezer. What's going on here? Why is Eliezer really getting to work? What's wrong with him here? You know. So the rabbis murmured about Rabbi Eliezer, at which point, of course, this is very good when you can get answers like this. The heavenly voice came forth and said, "You're wondering why it happened this way? It's not because that this man is greater than the other man that caused one prayer to be answered and the other one not. Rather, it is because this one, that is Rabbi Akiva, is a forgiving person and the other is not." So there are lots of stories about Rabbi Eliezer. He stands on his, he won't budge. If somebody does something wrong to him, he'll never forgive him. But now we got Rabbi Akiva depicted, maybe like in the story about he's sensitive to his wife, in certain sense, says don't, when the students want to get rid of the wife, he says, no, she's the one who made me. So here we have a different story in which clearly he's depicted as he's forgiving. Clearly didactic, yes. Okay. It's not learning. It's not by learning, right, per se, that one's better. He's a mensch. Akiva's willing to forgive. And so the story, again, it's a story to underscore the value of the importance of being forgiving. Yes. Well, yeah, so I think the first comment is not that he's greater in the sense of Torah knowledge, this is the tension, right? So here we have clearly a culture that the primary thing in life would be learning, and Torah studying, master of Torah, right? We had seen all these stories. But here's the counter voice, right? That if you're not a nice person, right? No matter how much Torah you know, how do you show that that's not so good to be? You could stand there all day and shry at me, God says, and I'm not going to helfen. I'm not going to help you, right? It's not going to help you at all. Yes?
It's particularly relevant that this is about praying for rain.
Okay.
Because in the rabbinic and the people's view, rain or other calamities were punishment.
Right. The holding back of rain is...
What's being asked for in your prayer is God's forgiveness.
Good.
How can a non-forgiving character
Oh,
ask God for forgiveness?
excellent, right? So that he said, Akiva says, I got nothing to stand on. I want you to clearly forgive us. And essentially, that's very excellent. That's why God answers him, because the same forgiveness, right, that Akiva exhibited by the way he formulated his prayer. Excellent, excellent.
This also ties in with the saying from Pirkei Avot, let not your learning exceed your deeds. All of this study, all this tremendous volume of words and studying, bottom line is behavior.
Ah,
And this is a reminder.
yeah. But clearly, the bottom line is behavior, but clearly it's not at the expense of Torah learning, right? So they're trying to hold these values, right? So this is not, to be fair, it's not saying Judaism's about ethics, right? It's both. I mean, we Jews in the modern world have said what Judaism is about is ethics. Clearly, they're trying to have Torah knowledge and behavior. But merely knowing everything and not being a mensch, not appreciating some degree of humility, being willing to forgive. I mean, think about this. Akiva sat with his own son at 40 years old, supposedly. Now we have another value of Akiva. He's menschy. He's forgiving. Yes? That's a much more complicated theological issue, and we'll see that the last text will disturb you. Not going to be such a happy ending. Right? Yes. Okay, so I want to jump now to page 2. I'll skip story 6. We don't have time for it. But this is an interesting story itself. It shows Akiva's sensitivity. But I want to move to text number 7. So we saw in the other story, Akiva's the gatherer of laws and everything like that. Text number 7, very interesting text. 4 entered paradise, pardes. Arba nichnasu lepardes. Orchard in Hebrew, but it's actually a Persian word, but we'll leave that aside. 1 looked and died. 1 looked and was stricken. 1 looked and cut the shoots. 1 went up in peace, and 1 came down in peace. Ben Azai looked and died. Ben Zoma looked and was stricken. Acher, who's a guy has a real name, it means the other one. Acher means the other one. His real name is Elisha ben Abuya. Acher looked and cut down the shoots. Rabbi Akiva went up in peace and came down in peace. What the heck is this about? Any idea? What'd you say? Exactly right. It's about Kabbalah. It's about mysticism. So let me explain. So here's the story. So this is understood to be an illusion, because you don't talk about these things so openly, but I think everybody here is over 40, so I can talk about Kabbalah, right? Although I'd have to ask the women to leave the room, but fortunately we have a much more progressive view these days. So this is an allusion to some kind of mystical experience. And clearly, who's the one who gets mystical experience correct? Akiba. The other guys did something wrong. One dies. One goes, seems like insane. Cut the shoots is an allusion to the fact that he becomes a apostate or a heretic. And only Akiba went up in peace and came down in peace. And so the story continues, just to give you a little flavor. A parable was offered. To what might this matter be compared? It is like a king's orchard with an upper chamber built above it. What should a person do? Look, but don't feast your eyes upon it. I don't know if the parable helps explain any of this either, but we'll come back to it. To what may this be compared? Sorry, I put it in twice. Sorry, I repeated it twice. What's this about? Any idea what the parable's trying to say? So I think it's something like this. There's a king who's in an orchard, and it has something above the orchard. What would be above the orchard? Who would be above the orchard? Well, but in the parable, it's the king. You can enter his orchard, but don't look directly at the king. Know your place. And the story, this is meant to suggest that Akiba recognized the limitations even of mystical experience. We could spend, a whole session, a whole number of weeks studying Jewish views of mysticism. For this purpose, all I want to underscore is, beyond the tradition imagining Akiba to be a great scholar of law, he also becomes the mystic par excellence. And that's in an early rabbinic text. The Talmud in number 8 sort of elaborates on this. Rabbi Akiva went up in peace and came down in peace. And of him scripture says, draw me after you, let us run. The king brought me into his chamber. And even Rabbi Akiva, the ministering angels, as he's sort of ascending into the heavenly realm, the ministering angels sought to push him away. But the Holy One, blessed be he, said, leave him alone, for he is worthy to make use of my glory. That's the Talmud commenting on this story, clearly wants to underscore that there are lots of stories in rabbinic literature about the angels, don't like what God's going to do. There's a story told when the God was going to create the world, the angels are fighting among themselves. One says, don't do it. They're going to mess up the world you're creating, God. And they're arguing, and the Midrash goes and says, God turns to them and says, too late, I already did it. While you were so busy haggling with each other, I created the human, done with it. So this idea of the angels and God sort of being in tension with each other is an interesting motif of rabbinic literature. And in this case, essentially God overrides the will of the angels and says, no, of these guys who came up, who sort of sought to be in my presence, mysticism's about sort of some kind of contact with the divine realm. Akiva got it right. And don't throw him down. Don't push him away. So he's clearly he's clearly now the mystic of all mystics. Now, I didn't give you a source here. Interestingly, I've been reading a lot about this lately. So what's the other branch of Torah learning? We have halakha. That is, learning the laws. Mishnah gives you the laws. One of the things about Mishnah generally is it doesn't cite the Tanakh. It doesn't cite the biblical text. It's organized topically. The second branch we see here is mysticism. And what's the third thing Jews do? How otherwise do Jews organize rabbinic writing? Agadah, especially Agadah in the form of Midrash. Midrash is where you cite a biblical verse and then you interpret it. And according to certain scholarship, there are two basic schools of Midrash. One is the Midrash of a person named Rabbi Ishmael, and the other are the Midrashim of the school of, guess who? Rabbi Akiba. And I may have a source here that speaks to that, but Akiba is also now the halachicist. Akiba is the midrashicist. Akiba is the mystic. He also knows how to daven well. Short, to the point. Sorry, Phil. One-liners, and he gets the answer. No need for 2-hour services. Keep it short. The sermonics were not, that's a whole other issue here, right? So this is really interesting that he really gets depicted, as being able to be the sort of the best person at each of these dimensions of rabbinic learning. But then source number 9. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai taught. Shimon ben Yochai is the guy we know about from Lag BaOmer with the bows and arrows, who's actually credited with the origins of the Zohar, right, of another mystic that's different dimension here. Rabbi Akiva taught. My teacher, Akiva, he's one of the 24,000, but we know his name. My teacher, Akiva, would interpret the verse, a star, Hebrew, kochav. A kochav shall rise from Yaakov. That's a verse actually from the prophecy of Bilam, right, from one of those prophets that Bilam, when he's brought by Balak, he makes this sentence, he makes this line. He means Kozibah rises from Jacob. When Rabbi Akiva beheld Bar Kozbah, he exclaimed, "This one is the Mashiach." Who's this Bar Kozibah? Bar Kochba. And it seems like Akiva, according to this tradition, endorses the claim that Bar Kochba was, in fact, the Mashiach. So to put this in context, and this will lead to another story, Bar Kochba leads the revolt in 132 against the Romans, but it didn't come out well in the end, right? We'll see some of the outplay of that. So in fact, probably as obscure as Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta, he wasn't a Mexican, Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta said to him, Akiva, grass will grow between your jaws, and the son of David, the Mashiach, will still not have come. So Jewish history is littered with any number of people who post facto we declare to have been false messiahs. How do you know when it's the real Messiah? When it works. It's as good as the answer that the Tanakh gives to how do you know when you have a real prophet? When what he says comes true. great post facto. But when the person comes here to start, it's not a very good criterion of how to decide whether I should listen to this guy. But here's another dimension. He gets now tied up into politics or to political dimensions of choosing the Messiah. But clearly, not everything Akiva does is correct. He blew this one. Which brings us to the next source that I think you would ask me about. So we read about what were the beginnings of Rabbi Akiva. And now we're going to read about what was the end of Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva said, he's reading the pasuk, right? V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha, right? B'chol nafshecha uv'chol miodecha. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And so he's doing a drash, he's doing an interpretation. With all your soul, what does it mean to love God with all your soul? Even if he, namely God, takes your soul away. Our rabbis taught, once the evil kingdom, namely Rome, issued a decree forbidding the Jews to occupy themselves with Torah. Papos ben Yehuda came and found Rabbi Akiva gathering crowds together in public and occupying himself with Torah. He said to him, Akiva, aren't you afraid of the kingdom? Different emotion, fear. Akiva says to him, I will tell you a parable. I can't answer you straightforward. You've got to figure out the parable. To what can this be compared? To a fox who was once walking alongside a river and saw swarms of fish going from place to place. He said to them, from what are you fleeing? The fish replied, from the nets that people throw into the river to catch us. So the clever fox, the rabbis knew of Aesop's fables, clearly as part of the broader Greco-Roman world, and we have all kinds of fables in the rabbinic stories too. The fox said to them, would you like to come up on the bank, on the dry land? And of course, we'll live together. Maybe you'll live in my tummy, but we'll live together in the same way that our ancestors lived with your ancestors. The fish are going, this is a very fishy story. I don't know anything about them. Sorry. Okay. They replied, are you really the one they call the cleverest of the animals? You're not so clever. You're a fool. If we are afraid of the place in which we know how to live, namely the water, how much more would be afraid in the place in which we do not know how to live? In other words, they said, "Du bist nur sehr klug." You're not so smart there, Mr. Fox, right? You think we're going to fall for this one? We're much more at home in the river. And even if the fishermen throw their nets in, we at least have some savvy, some know-how to avoid the net. If you take me out of the water and stick me on dry land, first of all, I don't know what to do there. Second of all, you're making that suggestion. It's not such a good idea, I don't think. So Akiva continued. So it is with us. He unpacks the parable for them, in case they didn't get the point. Sometimes the rabbis tell parables and you've got to figure out the point. So he said, maybe they didn't get the real message, so I'll tell them what I was trying to say. Now we sit and occupy ourselves with Torah. If this is our situation, when we sit and occupy ourselves with Torah, and of which it is written, for it is your life and the length of your days, how much the worse off would we be if we stopped doing what we know how to do, namely study Torah? like the fish. I'd rather stay and do what I know how to do than avoid it and think I'm going to be safer. Fully on the Romans, basically. It was said in just a few days, Rabbi Akiva was taken and put in prison, and Pappos ben Yehuda was also taken and imprisoned next to him. The guy who said, "What are you doing this for?" Well, he got caught too. Akiva said to him, "Pappos, what brought you here?" He replied, "Well, happy are you, Akiva, that you have been taken for occupying yourself to Torah, with Torah. Woe to Pappos, who has been taken for busying himself with worthless things." It's not clear exactly what he was doing, but guess what? When the Romans are out to get the people, they'll take some people with cause, and they'll take some people just because they happen to be hanging around. Right? Collateral damage. Or we got our quota. Yeah, they're rounding up the usual suspects. So what happens then? So Akiva says, at least I was doing what I think I should have been doing. Right? A Papa said to him, actually, at least you got caught, but you were doing what you as a Jew ought to be doing. At that hour, when Akiva was taken out for execution, some of you know the story, it was the time for the recital of the Shema. Thus, while they were combing the flesh with iron combs, he was accepting upon himself Ol Malchut Shemayim, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. His students said, "O Master, even at this point, even when you're about to die, is this what you're doing?" He said to them, next page. He didn't say to them, next page. I said that. He said to them, "All my days I have been troubled by the verse and its proper interpretation with all your soul, which I now understand to mean, you shall love the Lord your God with your soul, even if God takes your soul." I said, "When?" But I was distressed. I understood the verse meant, but I never thought I would have an opportunity to actually fulfill the demand to love the Lord your God with your soul. Now that I have the chance to fulfill it, shall I not fulfill it? In reciting the Shema, and the text goes on to say, in reciting the Shema, he prolonged the final word, Echad, right? Hear, O Lord, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And when he finished the Echad, his soul departed. And here's the heavenly voice again, shows up just when you need it, and proclaimed, "Happy are you, Akiva, that your soul has departed with the word Echad," an affirmation of the notion of monotheism and his willingness to die. So who's the Akiva in this story? Martyr. It's clearly celebrating he becomes the martyr par excellence. Teaching of Torah, of law, Midrash, Kabbalah, and also the value of martyrdom. Thoughts?
Back to what Doug said earlier. You may be a hero for doing this, but I can't live up to it. That can't be my ability. Can't be totally. It's too much.
Right, and there are rabbinic traditions to the contrary that say, if the enemy comes to pursue you, what do? Run away. This is traditional Jewish dialectics. For every adage, you have the opposite. Depends when you think one is relevant or not. So, I want to, we're near our end of our time. Just a couple of quick sources, and then I want to do text number 13. Text number 11, following up on what we just read. This is a short one. This is a midrash. Love your neighbor as yourself, the pasuk from Kedoshim. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Rabbi Akiba said, this is the great principle of Torah. The larger unit here, the sugya, is discussing what is the greatest, can you encapsulate Torah in not only in 25 words at a box top, but in a short, pithy saying. What's the most important value? For Akiva, it is love your neighbor as yourself. Ben Azai said, this is the record of Adam's lines from the beginning of chapter 5. What does he say? What's the point of, anybody have a sense of what Ben Azai is saying? These are the generations of Adam. It's understood to be his view that all humanity derives from one common ancestor. Now, whether whether we actually all come from Adam is not the point. It's the message that's trying to be conveyed. Nobody is greater than anybody else because we all have the same common ancestor. Go ahead. Yeah, so this if I could have done a whole hour with you and say, tell me what you think is the best verse or the most important idea in all of Jewish teaching. Anybody would have said, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," you should love your neighbor as yourself? Maybe. So the rabbis themselves are trying to figure out what's the most important value. Different source. In case we didn't have enough of rabbis like these dilemmas. A or B. Here's a different one. It once happened, my buddy Tarfon and the elders, he shows up a lot here today, I don't know why. We're gathered in the upper chamber of the house of Nitzah. He probably had a roof where they hung out. It's a whole interesting, in the house of, in Lud, watching the planes come and land. No, I guess not then. It wasn't an observatory. When the question was asked, which is greater, Talmud or Ma'aseh? Study or action? Deed, behavior. Rabbi Tarfon said, action, practice is greater, Ma'aseh. Akiva said, study is greater. And of course, who's right? Akiva. But as they all said, study leads to action. Not always. Some people don't figure out how to apply what they learn. But the theory is ultimately by study. Now, some people learn by doing, but clearly this is how the rabbis are kind of trying to balance again. What's more important, Torah study or living a life, observing commandments? So, in a certain sense, they say, of course, Torah study is most important. But essentially, it's only important if it leads to action. Last story, and we'll kind of ponder this one. Rabbi Judah said in the name of Rav. These are two later rabbinic sages. This is a very interesting story on many levels. Some of you have heard this before. When Moses ascended on high to receive the Torah, he found the Holy One, blessed be He, sitting and attaching little crowns to the letters, right? If you look at a Torah scroll, you'll notice certain letters have little things on top of them. They're called crowns. And he said to him, Moses said, Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, what is holding you back from giving the Torah? God replied, well, guess what, Moses? There will be a man in the future, at the end of a number of generations. And of course, his name is Akiba ben Joseph. He will interpret heaps and heaps of laws from just the tips of the crowns. This is the idea of where Rabbi Akiva is the great midrashicist. Now, it doesn't mean he actually interprets. What it's really saying is the Torah is a very complicated, coded message. And every letter, and even the spaces between the letters, and even the crowns on top of the letters, need to be understood to decode it. And he has that skill. So Moses said to him, Master of the universe, show him to me. So God puts him in a time capsule, time machine, and says to him, turn around. So Moses travels ahead the generations to the time of Rabbi Akiva. And Moses went and sat in the back of the room behind 8 rows of students. And they're supposedly studying, obviously, Torah. But Moses understand what they were saying. I thought I'm supposed to go to a class on Torah study. This is a Torah I brought down in a verstehe nicht. I don't understand one thing they're even talking about. He's kind of upset. That'd kind of not make your day. And when they came upon a certain matter, the students asked Rabbi Akiva, Master, from where do you know this? You're teaching a lesson. How do you know it? And he said to them, it's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. What I just taught you is a law given to Moses at Sinai. And Moses was comforted. Moses didn't understand anything, but at least he's told, whatever these guys have been talking about, it's my Torah. So it's not some crazy thing they're dealing with. So it's a very interesting story. It has multiple levels that the rabbis tell a story that essentially Moshe doesn't even understand Torah, even though Moses got the whole Torah oral and written at Sinai. Akiva's the one who understands it better than Moshe himself. Now, does that happen sometimes? That you say something, you don't realize the significance of what you say, and somebody says to you, that was a brilliant comment. You go, huh? You didn't realize the insight you had. So, except Moshe was a little upset. Okay, so that's a nice part of the story. Sort of the rabbis are showing here, ultimately the rabbis are disclosing their own dissonance. They're recognizing what they're doing, and essentially is not what the text may have meant to the original person. That's a whole interesting dimension of how the rabbis are kind of, what's called a counter text to their own values, that essentially Moshe doesn't even understand his own Torah, but what the rabbis are teaching, it's Moses' Torah, fine, I'm happy, Moses says. Now comes the discomforting thought. So Moses gets back in the time machine, goes back to his day and age, returns to the Holy One, blessed be He. So he says, Master of the universe, you have a man like this, and you're giving Torah through me? Again, one of the traits that the rabbis say, or the Torah says, what's the most important attribute of Moshe? Right? Anav. He was the most humble. So Moses recognizes, unlike Eliezer, Akiva's teacher is kind of upset that his student has surpassed him. Moses recognizes that this guy's smarter than me. Why are you giving the Torah through me? Why don't you just give it directly through through Akiva? So God says to him, Shah. Frag nicht zu viel Fragen. Don't ask too many questions. What? He's speaking Yiddish to him. Ich verstehe nicht. Was sagst du? Right? I don't understand anything. We haven't got to Eastern Europe yet. You know, if you spoke in Arabic, I'd have a shot. Not in Yiddish. But God says to him, Schweig, be quiet. I've decided it. You're going to get to bring the Torah. We're all going to sing around on simplest Torah, and we're going to sing Torah, 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 right? Torah, Tziva, Akiba. No, Moshe. Now, if you think you're disturbed by that, look at the next part. Why are the rabbis telling this story? So Moses said to God, Master of the universe, you have shown me his Torah. Now show me his reward. God said, well, turn around. Moses turned around and saw them weighing out Akiva's flesh in the marketplace. Clearly, this knows of the other story we just read of his martyrdom. Master of the universe, Zeh Torah v'zeh schorah. This is Torah, and this is reward. God says, shut up. I've decided it. What kind of story are the rabbis telling? Right, they created the story. What are they saying by telling a story like this in which the final, right, reward for Akiba is having his flesh sold by the pound? This is not the origin of Shylock, but you have an image here. Yes. You're going to say, oh, sorry, I thought you were going to say, what do you think? Yes. Okay, we should be comforted because God says, it's my way. Are you happy with that answer? No. You think the rabbis were happy with it when they wrote the story? No. Are they giving, do you sense they're giving expression to their own frustration? I mean, I started out, I didn't conceive of it this way, but essentially I started out, the first text we read quoted a verse from Job. If you know the book of Job now, if you have been able to sleep at night, read Job, it'll definitely put you to sleep, right? Or well, that's a different story. Read my dissertation, that will also put you to sleep. But clearly here, this is like Job, where when Job complains after God's, right, because he gets into a bet with the heavenly accuser, Satan says, hey, you think your guy Job is really such a tzaddik. Let's see how he is. God says, okay, go do what you want to do. Right, he kills his kids. He takes away all his property. Right, and Job, but leave out the story, and Job starts complaining, and, his friends come and tell him, it's because you sinned, and the story makes clear, no, those friends are no real friends. That's not because Job was unrighteous. And so Job finally turns to God, and God makes a big windstorm and says, basically, shut up. You don't understand anything. That's the way I run the world. And stop asking questions. And he beats Job down. So I think one of the things to say here is clearly the rabbis use Akiva as a literary device, as a name. And they hang on this person major values and major frustrations and questions. If you want to say and focus in on what are the core concerns of the rabbis, who's going to show up? Akiba. Somebody before asked me about, when we read a text and said something about, does God always do it? I forgot who made that comment. And I said, wait. Right? Here it is. Somebody, I forgot when we were reading in the first half, does God listen? And I said, wait. So what do you think? Right? I mean, essentially the rabbis are saying God chose. I mean, we won't get into a long story of how to deal with tragedies, but essentially, right, traditionally, when somebody passes away, you say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Somehow we affirm there's justice. There's some meaning, some purpose. We don't understand it. So the rabbis over the centuries, when these stories, and these are in text, I say the Babylonian Talmud, this text may be from the 5th century. Akiba supposedly lives in the 2nd century, but if I were to carefully trace when these different stories appear and which kind of literature. So we have documents that are composed over 5 centuries. So one of the things I should say that my own teacher is kind of the person who upset the apple cart, because people used to write biographies of rabbis and find a saying, it could be in a 6th century document, a 4th century document. They took it as historically reliable, they put them all together, and they wrote a biography. What Barry Holt says, this is not really biographies. These are the creations of legends to communicate cultural values. And we see this going on over the course of any number of centuries. Does the hero make the times or the times make the hero? The truth is the times change. And the image of Akiva also changes to address the concerns of his age. And the Akiva of one time may not have responded adequately, or the image of Akiva of one generation may not have been adequate to respond to fundamental questions, serious concerns of people of a particular era. And so, we remake Akiva in that sense to respond to the issues of the age. I think that dynamic is fairly clear here, and he becomes a communicator of central values. Yes?
To me, the last sentence practices relevant society. It's like martyrdom is necessary for immortality.
Well, yeah, so the one way of reading it is, of course, the premise of the story is there's Olam Haba, there's the world to come. So in the end, don't worry about it. Even if Akiva dies here, he'll get his reward. But they don't say that. I don't see the text wanting to say, everything's wonderful, it all worked, they lived happily ever after in another life. I think the text really wants to give voice to the perplexities that humans face. And don't brush it under the rug, as it were, and simply say, things happen, and ultimately, do we say has no meaning? Or do we say there must be some order here? Or do we find the meaning by telling the story? I must say, when I first met Rabbi Feinstein, I've always admired him. I was blown away the first time I ever heard him tell stories. And I remember at camp, when he would gather the kids around, especially on Shabbat afternoon after Menucha, and people would listen to the stories. And I think that's true here too, the power of the story, the telling of the story is, even if it's not always clear, the message. And if you didn't understand the story and the point, I'll tell you a parable which you don't understand either. But that challenges us. Because what do we do then? We have to sit and discuss it. And it's been my pleasure to spend the evening with you discussing these texts. Thank you.